The second way to use native JS to make a asynchronous call is using fetch API. So in JS, there is a fetch method that provides an easy, logical way to fetch resources asynchronously across the network. Do you remember there is a window object? We call it global object in JS. We can use window.onload or window.open, window.close to open and close a current web page. So it is a global object. Fetch method belongs to window object. So in order to use this method, we can use the syntax like window.fetch. But remember, if a method or attribute belongs to window, we can omit window. Simply just use fetch. So you can write fetch directly in your script. Fetch API is supposed to replace our old friend, XHR, or XML HTTP request. In previous videos, I'm sure everyone knows how tedious it is to use XHR to make a request. There are 4 steps. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use Fetch API to simplify this process. So once you use Fetch API, you'll never want to go back to our old friend XHR. So now we can say goodbye to XHR and start to use Fetch API. One of the main differences between Fetch API and XHR is that Fetch API is using the concept called promise. What is a JS promise? Simply put, a JS promise represents a future result, and it can be success or can be failure. One property of asynchronous is once we send an asynchronous call, and later on the server will respond, but we never know if the response is success or failure, and the JS code will never wait for the response, will keep going. So the promise really represents a future result. So without further ado, let's look at an example. And we're under Ajax demo and under web, under 03 fetch API. In this case, we're going to fetch 5 random jokes from Chuck Norris. I find this API online. So let me go to Google Chrome, and we're going to www.icndb. So this is the Internet Chuck Norris database. Once you are here, and you can find all the jokes, and guess what? There is an API. So if I click this API here, this website provides some public open APIs that we can call to get some data in JSON format. And here it explains this is the base URL. If I scroll down, we can fetch a random joke using this URL, or we can fetch multiple random jokes using random / the number of jokes you want to fetch. And in this case, we're fetching 5 jokes from this API. Use fetch. Remember, this is a method belongs to window. We can omit window dot. So simply just using fetch. And this is also optional because by default, it is get method. But here, I put it here to make it explicit. So method is equal to get. So this is a JavaScript object, key value. This fetch will return a promise object. We're using .then to retrieve the response in the previously returned object. So this one is execute first, and this returns a promise. Then we're retrieving the response in the promise. And once we're here, we first print this response in console, and then we return response.json. In other words, we're converting the response into JSON because by default, this response is not JSON format. So we're going to return it. The next then in this chain will get this data. So basically what happened is the return value of this then becomes the input of next then. And you can keep doing this, but in this case, we have 2 things. There are actually 3 steps. We get this promise, and this promise, we retrieve response and pass it to the first then. The first then returns response.json, and that's the input of the second then. In the second then, we simply just print the data, which is an array of the 5 jokes. So let me show you the example. And I'm going to press fetch API. Now pay attention to the console because we are not printing anything to HTML, we're printing everything to the console. When I press API, I will first print response, and then I will print response.json. Please make sure you know the difference. I'm going to press. So there are 2 results. The first one is a response that's in the first then, if you still remember. So So let me put them side by side. So the first then we log response, and this is the response. If I expand it, status is okay, that means this is a success. But we cannot find our data here. So we have to convert or serialize this response into JSON. And we're using a method called JSON on response. So the second console.log, we're printing response.json. It's still success, and we got an array. And the array has 5 jokes from Chuck Norris. In summary, how to use fetch API. We start the request by calling fetch and then pass the URL to fetch. And this fetch will return a promise. When the promise is fulfilled, it returns a response object. However, we cannot access response object because it's not in JSON, and we have to call a JSON method to return the result or response in JSON format. And this return value becomes the input of the second then. In the second then, we print data. In previous example, I showed you how to use fetch to get some data from a public API. Now, in this example, 04 fetch API different request methods, I'm going to show you how to use fetch to make get, put, post, delete request. Let's take a look at this example. I'm sure you're familiar with the get. So fetch, and this is the URL, and this is the method. And then we have then response dot then data. So this is very similar to the previous example. Take a look at this URL. Find one question mark ID equal to 123. So we're going to src. We're going to find all servlet. This servlet receives a get request, and in get request, we're going to retrieve the parameter ID, and then we're trying to find a user with this ID, and then return this user as JSON. Once we find this user from database, and of course, I'm not really talking to database, I'm trying to simulate a database access. I create a new user, Harry Potter, age 35, and birthday new date. If you still remember, we're using result to encapsulate all the result, status code and message, and this is the data. Then we serialize it into JSON and write it back to the browser or to the front end. Let me show you what happened. So when I press 04, as you can see, we have this data here. The data part has ID 123, name, age, birthday in JSON. And status, message, and data together is the JSON string of result. But the data here is the real payload. Next, I will demo how to use fetch API to send a delete request. I have commented out the method equal to get, that's in previous example, and I uncomment fetch method equal to delete. So in this example, we're requesting this URL. Basically, we're telling the servlet we want to delete a user with ID equal to 123. Once we got this promise, we'll pass to the first then, and the first then will convert response to JSON and pass the result to second then. Second then will print the data from servlet. So let's take a look at the delete servlet. So in this servlet, first we'll retrieve the value of ID to make sure we know which user we want to delete. I'm not really going to delete this user. I simply just print a message to the console on IntelliJ. Then we create an instance of result, and we're set status to 200, and we set message to delete user success. In this case, we do not have to send any payload back to front end, so we didn't set data. And then we write it back as JSON string. Let me launch it so you can see the result. Pay attention to the console. I'm going to press 04 fetch API, and what we're getting is delete user success. It looks like we didn't really print the response. We simply just print response.json. So 200 delete user success, data is equal to null, because on the backend, we didn't put anything in set data. In this example, I'm going to show you how to use fetch to send a HTTP post request. This is very different from get and delete, because in get and delete, so let me scroll up. If we are trying to send something to the backend, we can use query string. So this is the URL of the servlet, and this is a query string with the data we want to send back. And same thing here in delete. In post, the first argument of fetch method only has the URL of the servlet, which is save servlet. Then how do we send data to the backend using post? We put the data in the second argument of fetch method. So this entire thing here, the highlighted part, is the second argument of fetch. It is a JS object. And this object has three attributes. Method is post, body is the data we're going to send to the backend, and headers includes all the headers. And of course, you can have as many as you want, and you can separate using comma. But in this case, we simply have one header, just telling the backend this is JSON data. Let's take a look at the second attribute. Body is equal to JSON.stringify. That is, we're converting this JS object into JSON string and only send this JSON string. So please note, you can never put a JS object directly into body. We have to first convert it to or serialize it to JSON string and then put it here. We'll talk more about this method later on. But for now, we know that we're going to send a post request with a JSON data, name equal to Harry Potter, age 45, birthday is 1990. And after this fetch, we have the two then methods. Now let's take a look at save servlet. In save servlet, the servlet needs to accept this post request and also accept this JSON string. Think about this. How does a servlet receive a JSON string? Let's take a look at save servlet. Here is save servlet. Since the data we received is a JSON string, we cannot use request.getParameter. So we have to use a method called request.getReader, and using this buffer reader to read the input as strings. So we create an empty JSON string, and then we're using this while loop to read all the inputs and append them to JSON string. So when this try catch is done, JSON string has this object in JSON string. So when I launch it, I will show you what is the JSON string. After we have this JSON string, it's just a string, and we need to convert it to a Java object to do later process. For example, using Hibernate to save it in database, because in Java, everything is object, and we can do nothing about this string. How to convert JSON to Java object? And we should use a powerful package called JSON. In previous examples, we used JSON to convert Java object to JSON. Now this time, we're going to do the reverse, convert a JSON string to Java object. It's very simple. We only need one line of code. After we create an instance of object mapper, we're still going to use mapper. We're going to use a method called mapper.readValue, and we're going to pass the JSON string, and then the second argument is the class of the user. In other words, we're going to convert this string to an instance of this class, and it returns a user. Guess what? This user is Harry Potter, and we can print it out. So after this, the last step is we're going to provide a response to the front end. So we create a result, we set status, and we set message. Since there's nothing we need to send to the front end, we do not set data. And we're going to use response.getWriter.write to write this result as string. So let me launch the project so you can see what happened. I'm going to press O for fetch API, and then we're getting the response from the backend. And as you can see, we have 200, we have save user success, but we don't have any data. Now let's go to IntelliJ to see what is printed. Remember, in IntelliJ, we're printing the JSON string here, And after we convert this JSON string to Java object, we're going to print this user object. So look at this too. So this is the JSON string we get from the front end. And after we convert it to a Java object, and we can print this object, and this is how we print this object, because we override the toString method. So let's take a look at this toString method. It's here. So we print an entire object. This is what is printed. So Harry Potter 45, and this is the Java date. In this example, what I want you to know is how can we use servlet to receive an entire JSON string. We have to use request.getReader. You cannot use request.get parameter. So that's the way we use to get entire JSON string. Then the second point is how can we convert a JSON string to a Java object? By using mapper.readValue. It has two arguments. The first one is the JSON string. The second one is the class template. So this method will convert the string to an object or instance of this class automatically. This is the last example in O4 Fetch API different request methods.html. Fetch also support sending put request. If you remember, in HTML request methods, put represents update in CRUD. So for example, in this case, the meaning of this request is we're telling the backend side we're going to modify something in an existing user. For example, we're going to change the age from 45 to 50. Now remember, in post corresponds to create, right? We're saving a brand new user, and the user's age is 45. Now after the user is already there in database, now how do we let the server know we're going to update something? We're using a method called put. We're changing the age from 45 to 50. As you can see, put request is very similar to post request. To save time, I'm not going to demo it to you because everything is the same except method equal to put. And in order to update the user, we need to take a look at update servlet. Now in update servlet, we're doing the same thing. It's very similar to save servlet. So we're using getReader to read the JSON string, and we're using mapper.readValue to convert string to object, and we're writing back a response. It's very similar to post. Right now, I'm under 05 fetch response.html. In this example, we're going to fetch 5 random jokes from internet chucknorrisdatabase.com. And in the first then, we're going to convert the response to JSON. And in the second then, we're going to print data here, which is response.json. And also, we're going to retrieve the very first joke among the 5 jokes. So we're using the syntax like data.value0joke. And how do I know this? I know this structure because I viewed data object. So once I understand the structure of data, you will know how to retrieve some attributes from this data. So it looks like in data, there is a value attribute, and this value attribute is an array, and I only want the first item. And in the first item, I only want the joke attribute, which is the joke in string. So let's go to Chrome. If I press 05 fetch response.html, pay attention to the console. So first we'll print this data object, and then we'll print data.value0.joke. The first one is the entire data. And the second one is the first joke in string. Chuck Norris does not step on toes. Chuck Norris steps on necks. So if I expand data, it's a pretty complex object. So the data object has 2 attributes, actually it has more, but it has 2 important attributes. Type equal to success, we're not interested in those. We're interested in value. And looks like value is an array of 5 jokes. And how do I extract the first joke? So go to value brackets 0, and in 0, there are 2 more attributes, ID and joke. And we're not interested in this ID, we simply want joke. So data, this entire thing is data dot value brackets 0 dot joke. That gives us the joke in string. So an important thing about handling response or sending request is understand your data. understand how the data is constructed in JSON format. Then you can use this dot, select operator, and brackets to retrieve the things you want.